give is so expensive. You might love you can get it back credit. Don't let it get away. Don't make it fade away. Don't let it get away. Don't let it get away. Don't make it stray away. I gave my love, it will never come away. So long your habits on the run. Girl, I won't let you be the only one. I can be sure that your love will be secure. All you have to do is keep on dropping to my door. So don't let it get away. Don't make it fade away. Don't let it go astray. Don't let it get away. Don't make it fade away. I gave my love, it will never come away. Oh yeah. Ah yeah. Oh yeah. The fragrance of your skin constant linger on my room. Some love a blue and some blues. Baby, I won't let you see the blue. So don't let it get away. Don't make it fade away. Don't make it get away. Yeah. Don't let it get away. Don't make it fade away. I give my love, it may never come away.
I dressed myself in $100 pleated slacks. Who made this coat? Hugo Boss, Armani? You set up broke? Hell, my life just started, Jack. You keep your mouth shut. I'm gonna go in there and slap your face. I ain't leaving. I'll wear a $15,000 Rolex and you get on Space Mountain. You'll be like this. And now, you and I are limousine ride, jet flying, kiss stealing, wheeling dealing, son of a gun. Oh, who are you? Diver, tell me how to wrestle. Right life, big cities. I am Ric Flair, the President of the United States. Kissed all the girls in the neighborhood and made them pie. Kiss stealing, wheeling dealing.
God's story, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So part of God's story is about three guys and a raging fire, and it goes like this. God's special family, the Israelites, were sent to live in a place called Babylon. It wasn't their real home, and they were ruled by a king who didn't follow God. His name was King Nebuchadnezzar, and he decided to choose the smartest, strongest, most handsome Jewish men to leave their home and come work for him in his palace. Three of the guys he chose were named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Actually, they had different names before that, but the king forced them to change their names. They went through a 3-year training program where they learned the official language and fancy laws of the kingdom. Can you imagine if you had to move to a strange new place and be forced to change your name? That would be pretty hard. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego kept following God no matter what. They just had to figure out how to obey God and serve the king. One day, King Nebuchadnezzar decided to build a giant gold statue of himself. It was 90 feet tall. That's like 3 school buses stacked on top of each other. And every time the people heard trumpets, they had to stop what they were doing, bow down, and worship the statue. Anybody who didn't worship it would be thrown into a fiery furnace. Back then, that was like a room full of fire. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew that their God was the only real God, and they should never worship anyone but him. So when everyone else was bowing to the statue, they didn't. The king was furious when he heard about this, but he decided to give them a second chance. He had Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego brought before him so they could change their minds. But instead, they told the king, "We do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, The God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will deliver us from your hand. So brought before him so they could change their minds. But instead they told the king, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will deliver us from your hand. But even if he doesn't, we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. Nebuchadnezzar was so mad, he ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded his men to throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the blazing fire. So they did. The furnace was so hot that even some of the king's own men were killed just by getting too close to the fire. Well, pretty soon, the king looked into the furnace and noticed there weren't just 3 men in the furnace. There was someone else in there with them. And they were all walking around. We don't know who that 4th person was. Some people think it was Jesus. Some people think it was an angel. Whoever it was, God was protecting them from the fire. And when the king ordered them to walk out of the furnace, they weren't burned at all. They didn't even smell like smoke. The king was amazed. He said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who had angel and rescued his servants." The king had never seen a God who would rescue his people like that. After this, the king actually encouraged people to worship God. He even told the people in Babylon they could never say anything against God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego trusted in God and were willing to give up their lives rather than worship anyone except God. Whenever they in God or something else, they chose God every time. No matter what went through, God was always with them.
London has a rich mixture of people from all over the world. The population is constantly changing. People have been coming and going for centuries. In the last 60 years, a lot of black and Asian people have settled in London and other parts of Britain. My parents came over from Ghana at the beginning of the 70s, but there were black communities here long before that, even as far back as Roman times. In fact, there was an African Roman emperor. Septimus Severus was born in Libya. As Roman emperor, he ruled large sections of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. When he came to Hadrian's Wall in Britain in 208 AD, there were black soldiers already stationed there. They had travelled right across the empire. This is part of the Roman Wall by the Museum of London. It used to be much bigger and stretched all the way around the old city. It's been here nearly 2,000 years. And we know there were black Romans in Britain at about the time this was built because of the evidence that archaeologists have found. Like African-style Roman objects on display at the Museum of London.
Slavery. To this day, it remains one of the ugliest blots in the long journey of humanity. Slavery can be traced back as early as 4000 BC, as old as written history itself. From Mesopotamia to Egypt, from Greece to Rome, through the Middle Ages and into the African slave trade, the enslavement of one human being by another has wedged its cruel memory into the hearts and minds of human consciousness. Even today, the African slave trade remains etched in our souls as the ultimate degradation of mankind. The man who perhaps more than any other stirred the conscience of the world to see the horror and evil of slavery was William Wilberforce. His efforts helped bring liberty to untold millions. His persistence and conviction influenced major change in the thinking and the history of the world. William Wilberforce was born in 1759 in the bustling seaport of Kingston-on-Hull in England. His father was a prosperous merchant. The family lived comfortably in their High Street mansion. The world into which Wilberforce was born had two faces. There was the elegant and affluent face of a world smugly aware that it was the age of enlightenment. But there was also the horrible face of cruelty, corruption, and extreme poverty. The luxury of the few on top was made possible by the multitudes below, who could only eke out a meager existence. Cheap gin often provided welcome escape. Brutal sports were the most popular distraction. The slave trade, child labor, and the dehumanizing hardships of the emerging Industrial Revolution were expressions of a heartlessness that infected every level of society. Against this setting, Wilberforce came to Parliament representing Hull in 1780 when he was 21. He was the closest friend of the Prime Minister, William Pitt, but they were two quite different men. Pitt, 3 years ahead of Wilberforce at Cambridge University, had been a serious, conscientious student. He was tall and reserved. Wilberforce was cheerful, frivolous, a pleasure seeker, small and slight in stature. But he also was a man of great wit and charm that served him well as he enjoyed the dazzling life of 18th century London. Wilberforce, Pitt, and some of their friends were great frequenters of the clubs in St. James. Their favorite haunt was called Goose Trees. Here, a young man would make or lose a fortune at the gambling tables in a single night. Wilberforce was also a great orator in an age noted for its outstanding orators, and he had such a fine singing voice, he was called the Nightingale of the House of Commons. So, not surprisingly, dashing young William was in great demand on the social scene. When the Prince of Wales heard him sing at the Duchess of Devonshire's ball, he declared that he would go anywhere to hear him. In 1783, Wilberforce became representative of the county of Yorkshire. That was the most important and coveted seat in the House of Commons. While he was campaigning one day, the great British writer James Boswell heard him give a rousing speech. Boswell later wrote, "I saw what seemed a mere shrimp of a man mount on a table, but as I listened, he grew and grew until the shrimp became a whale." The crowd shouted for this little man to be their representative, and he was elected. The victory placed him just below the top leaders. He was the closest ally of Pitt. A brilliant future seemed assured. The next year, Wilberforce went to Europe with his former tutor, Isaac Milner. This trip would shake William Wilberforce to the core of his being. Milner was a brilliant man who grasped the heart of Christianity. They had plenty of time to talk and think, and Milner helped Wilberforce consider his life, his relationship with God, and the meaning of Christianity. As a result of this time together, Wilberforce experienced a profound and noticeable change in his thinking, his life, and his character. In the months that followed, Wilberforce rose early each morning to seek God's guidance and to record his meditations in a journal. He radically changed many of his habits. He gave up gambling when he won a huge amount from some players he knew could not afford the loss. He resigned from all the clubs he had previously enjoyed so much. He quit drinking the nights away and concentrated on building real friendships. Now he had to face what it would mean to his public image if he were seen to be an evangelical Christian, for they were mockingly called enthusiasts and were commonly attacked for their outspoken faith and spiritual vitality. One of the evangelicals was the Reverend John Newton. He formerly had worked the slave ships. In fact, at one time he actually was made a servant to slaves in Africa, but he later advanced to become a captain of a slave ship. The great blasphemer, as he was once known, had become a devout Christian and is still remembered today as the author of perhaps the best-known hymn in all history, Amazing Grace. Newton had become minister of a church in London. In Wilberforce's journal, there appears an entry repeated often that said, "Go and converse with Mr. Newton." After much inner struggle, Wilberforce finally went secretly to Newton's home. Their meeting was a turning point for the young politician. In his journal, Wilberforce stated, "When I came away, my mind was in a calm and tranquil state. And from that point on, he no longer seemed to be afraid of what people would think of him for his deepening Christian convictions." However, Wilberforce was concerned about his relationship with the Prime Minister, William Pitt. After all, they were old friends, and Wilberforce was said to be the only one that Pitt really trusted. They loved to get away from the pressures of government, to relax and unwind together at Wilberforce's home in Wimbledon. And Pitt counted heavily on Wilberforce's support in Parliament. "But I cannot be such a political party man as before," Wilberforce wrote. Now he voted and spoke his own conscience. He searched intently to find what really was his calling in life. Through Newton and others, his attention turned more and more toward the slave trade. Since 1713, Britain was the leading slave-trading nation of Europe. Slavery was one of her most profitable industries. Ships sailed from British ports to the west coast of Africa. There, they captured human cargoes, or they simply bought them from traders. Some African chiefs were known to have sold the entire population, some of their own villages, for brandy or gunpowder. 70,000 black men, women, and children were shipped every year to plantations in the West Indies and America. Below deck, they were chained on shelves with less than 3 feet of headroom. No one even knows how many thousands died because of the appalling conditions aboard ship. Others died of suicide, broken hearts, or brutal treatment from the masters. Records show that in one 10-year period, ships from Liverpool, England alone carried more than 300,000 slaves and sold for millions of pounds. The slaves were auctioned off as if they were cattle. Healthy men sold for up to 40 pounds each. Sick and wounded men, women, and children sold for less. At these auctions, families would be broken up, sold to different owners, sometimes never to see each other again for the rest of their lives. This profitable traffic in human flesh exploited white victims as well. Young men were seized in the streets and forced to serve as crew on slave ships. Others were lured into debt by gambling in taverns. For many, such drunken debts meant either going to prison or to work on the slave ships. Multitudes of poor people were kidnapped and sent to the plantations for 7 to 10 years as so-called indentured servants. Their owners had no long-term use for them, so they often were treated as cruelly as the black slaves themselves. Owners of the slave plantations would return from the Americas and use their wealth to purchase not only large estates in England, but also seats in Parliament. They gathered into a powerful lobby to protect their profitable business. Slave trading brought considerable wealth to many areas of Britain, It was taken for granted that the commerce and prosperity of the country depended on it. But there were voices in the 18th century that began to speak out. Preacher John Wesley railed against the slave trade as the execrable sum of human villainy. Other respected figures, such as Samuel Johnson, publicly voiced opposition, but to no avail. Granville Sharp, a clerk in the Government Ordnance Office, taught himself law, and for years he pleaded for the mistreated slaves in Britain. His compassion and persistence led to the first real breakthrough, when the British courts granted freedom to slaves on British soil in 1772. But this applied only to Britain. It did nothing to help the masses of slaves toiling under brutal conditions across the seas, safely out of sight of the British people. Then, in 1783, an appalling event seized the attention of all of Britain. The slave ship Zong, bursting with slaves packed between its decks, got lost on the way to the West Indies. 67 died on board from an epidemic. The captain of the ship threw 132 slaves, still alive, into the sea. This was on the pretext, the captain said, of saving the rest of the cargo, so it would be the insurance company, not the slave owners, who had to pay. One of the survivors got to Granville Sharp with the story. The ensuing court hearing cleared the captain of all blame. The court ruled that it was as if horses had been thrown overboard. Slaves were not to be regarded as people. They were just another form of property. This incident began to unite the anti-slavery forces. A group of 6 Quakers formed an abolition committee. Granville Sharp and a few others joined with them. But they could not make their case without more solid evidence. They had to get first-hand proof of what was really happening, and that help would come from a young surgeon, James Ramsay. Years before, Ramsay was serving on the British Navy frigate Arundel in the West Indies under Captain Charles Middleton. On November 21, 1759, they encountered a slave ship and found a plague was raging on board. The young surgeon offered to board the slave ship to provide help. He was shocked by the sights he saw. He never forgot the horrors of the slaves' conditions. From that day on, he was implacably opposed to slavery. Later, Dr. Ramsay was ordained into the Christian ministry and lived for many years on the island of St. Christopher. There, he struggled to improve the conditions of the slaves. The plantation owners bitterly opposed him and gradually wore him down. Finally, he gave up and returned home to England. His old naval captain, Sir Charles Middleton, had now become an important man in the village of Teston in Kent. In 1781, he arranged for Ramsay to become rector of the church there, some 22 years after Ramsay had boarded the slave ship as a doctor. The Middletons were Ramsay's neighbors. He gave them his detailed first-hand knowledge of the slave trade. Lady Middleton was moved. She urged Ramsay to go public, but Ramsay was afraid and had good reason to be. But Lady Middleton persisted, and Ramsay finally gave in, publishing a pamphlet telling the whole sordid story. Ramsay's writings aroused a storm of opposition. On the one hand, the slave traders did not want a troublemaker meddling in their very profitable business. On the other hand, his pamphlet was so convincing, it fired up many, including Sir Charles Middleton himself. Ramsay and Middleton gathered a group to work for the abolition of slavery. In the group, not surprisingly, was Granville Sharp. Also, a capable young Cambridge University graduate, Thomas Clarkson, who became the first to devote all his time to the cause. Sir Charles became a member of the British Parliament, one of only 2 members who were known to be evangelical Christians. He needed to find someone in the House to spearhead the anti-slavery clause. It would take someone very special to get this through Parliament, and the job would not be easy. Who had the courage to risk ruining his political career? Who was independent enough to win support from various parties, yet strong enough to put the cause ahead of the interests of his own party? Who was important enough, socially, to be listened to by the greatest in the land? The choice was obvious. It had to be William Wilberforce. Sir Charles Middleton, now an admiral, wrote William urging him to spearhead the abolition movement in Parliament. It was a responsibility Wilberforce weighed carefully, and he visited the Middletons to talk about it. That other early advocate of abolition, Thomas Clarkson, also pressed the case. He visited Wilberforce several times in the old palace yard at Westminster to enlist his support. Finally, it all seemed to come together for Wilberforce one day while visiting Pitt at his country home. The Prime Minister, Pitt himself, suggested that Wilberforce introduce a motion in the House of Commons for the abolition of the slave trade. After the meeting, Wilberforce wrote in his journal, "God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners, morals, in this country." He began to feel that if the slave trade were destroyed, it would be a key to humanizing the entire spirit of the nation. Thomas Clarkson agreed to gather the facts and traveled to all the main slave trading ports. In Bristol, he ran into cruel opposition, and it was said that he was shunned in the streets like a mad dog. But he found a hearing in the taverns in London and Liverpool. The seamen, who often were treated as badly as the slaves themselves, flocked to hear him. Clarkson drew up diagrams of a slave ship to show how the slaves were packed onto shelves in horrifying conditions. From these plans, a model was made that Wilberforce used as a visual aid in his campaign. Another visual aid they employed was a porcelain cameo made by Josiah Wedgwood the potter, whose name still is well known today for fine china.
So don't let it get away, don't make it